Welcome to I Was Only Doing My Job, Australia's military history told through the stories of those who've served. I'm your host, Ross Manuel, and let's get started. G'day friends, and welcome to the last episode of 2022. A huge thank you again to everyone who has supported the podcast this year, and a warm welcome to everyone who's joining me right now on this adventure. Before we get started, I wanted to share a couple of messages I've received from listeners. I received a message late one night from a listener who told me they had listened to the podcast's entire back catalogue on the 9-hour journey from Canberra to the Royal Australian Navy's training base of HMAS Cerberus in Melbourne. And another informed me they had listened from Canberra to Brisbane, which is just over 12 hours by car. I have to say to both these people, thank you for your support, and I'm also very impressed, because I can't convince my wife to listen to me talk that long. So I hope you both hear this, and when I eventually find some merch or something, I'll make sure some goes your way. But once again, thank you. And like these awesome people, you want to send the podcast a message, the best way to do so is use the email link in the show notes. Alternatively, you can join in on the conversation on our Discord server. There's a link to that in the show notes as well. You can also find the show on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where you'll also find my travels around Australia, finding the myriad of memorials that dot the countryside, where you also find links to our website, which show the actual show notes and photos about this and other episodes. But now that's all out of the way, let's get started. Noel Ervin Shipp was born in Brisbane on Christmas Eve 1944, which makes today his 78th birthday. He was one of 4 children to Raymond Clarence Williams and Catherine Mary Shipp. He was educated in Julia Creek, North Queensland. By the 11th of January 1963, the age of 19, with the Vietnam War in full swing, he joined the Royal Australian Navy and married Gloria. Prior to enlistment, he was employed as a truck off-sider. Now, for most of my audience, they probably haven't heard of the term truck off-sider before, and it's probably because, as of the 2022 Australian census, only about 1,500 people were employed in the role. I actually had to call my stepfather, who was a truckie in the 70s, to explain the position for me. Essentially, a truck off-sider was a gopher. They assisted the driver in loading, stacking, securing loads onto the back of trucks in an age before the current stocked cages and container trailers, as well as the securing of loads and tarpaulins. Then they assisted with the unloading. Modern warehousing, self-contained semi-trailers, and logistics procedures have largely done away with the position, though it does still exist in specialist areas, mainly in furniture removalists. On the 11th of January 1963, Noel presented to the Royal Australian Navy's recruit training school HMAS Cerberus as an underwater control rating. For those unfamiliar with naval rank nomenclature, a rating is a junior enlisted sailor who is not a warrant officer or commissioned officer, and in the British Commonwealth countries, it generally came from the general nautical usage to refer to a seaman's class or grade. A sailor's rating was also often paired with their category or specialty qualification. An underwater control rating worked aboard surface vessels in the operations room, manning the vessel's sonar system to hunt for submarines and other underwater obstacles. As of 2022, the position no longer exists. Following his training, he was posted to the RAN land installations, HMAS Watson, Harmon, and Penguin, with his first sea posting being the River-class destroyer escort, HMAS Yarra 3, as part of the Strategic Far East Reserve, patrolling the Commonwealth interest in Southeast Asia, from the threat of communism. Returning to HMAS Watson, Noel would then be posted to the venerable frigate HMAS Gascoigne as an ordinary seaman underwater control. The Gascoigne at this point had been converted to a survey and oceanographic research vessel, which would have been an invaluable time for a sailor tasked with hunting submarines. In 1964, he was posted to HMAS Anzac II, first as an Able Seaman Underwater Control Class 2 in March, and then Able Seaman Underwater Control Class 1 in November. He would rotate between Anzac and Watson for the next 2 years on Strategic Far East Reserve duties until the 10th of July 1967, when Noel volunteered to undergo training as a provisional leading air crewman to operate airborne sonar systems at the Naval Air Station Nowra at the shore installation HMAS Albatross, the home of the Royal Australian Navy's Fleet Air Arm. In December 1967, Noel and Gloria would also welcome their son Darren, while he was at training. In 1966, the United States of America made a request of the Australian government for more helicopter pilots and crews to go to Vietnam, as the surge in Allied troops in country had exceeded the operational capacity of the available helicopter transport and support units already there. Due to Australian Army Aviation and Royal Australian Air Force commitments in Vietnam and elsewhere, the only available pilots were from the Fleet Air Arm, the first unit in Australia to actually establish a pure helicopter force. Helicopters were first used in war during the closing stages of the Second World War, albeit to a minimal degree, By Korea, they had started to be involved in combat areas mainly in supply, medevac, and transport roles, an example made famous by the series MASH. By 1965, the role of the helicopter had been so completely reimagined on the battlefield, the results were stunning, transformative, and produced a tactical revolution. The problem was, there just weren't enough aircrew to make it work properly. The Fleet Air Arm crews were initially integrated with No. 9 Squadron Royal Australian Air Force, until the United States Army requested that the RAN pilots were also integrated into one of their own helicopter companies. As a result, on the 14th of July 1967, it was announced that the RAN Helicopter Flight Vietnam, or RAN HFV, would be created and combined with the US Army's 135th Assault Helicopter Company to form the experimental military unit nicknamed EMU, which was appropriate given the number of Australians in the company, though the irony that emus are flightless birds was not lost to them. Also, cue EMU war puns. Due to the training disparity between the two units, with Fleet Air Arm air crews having been used extensively in anti-submarine warfare operations in the South Pacific, and had on average over 1,000 flight hours compared to the 150 for most American pilots, Australian personnel would end up holding senior positions within the unit. Though even with that experience, the Australian pilots lacked combat flying experience that the Americans had. The unit was initially based at Camp Black Horse, roughly 58 kilometers from Saigon in the middle of rubber plantations and jungle. The main role of the EMUs was to provide transport and support for units of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam along with Australian and US forces. This meant that the crews often worked long hours on extremely dangerous operations. To facilitate this, the EMUs were comprised of several platoons of the ubiquitous UH-1 Iroquois aircraft, otherwise known as the Huey, with the overwhelming number of them being UH-1D troop carriers, supported by UH-1C gunships. Aircrew carrying soldiers expected to be, quote, fired at on every second mission, unquote. They also had to contend with booby-trapped landing zones and Viet Cong troops infiltrating the ranks of South Vietnamese soldiers. EMU had already been operating in country for over a year by the time that Noel had been posted to the second contingent of the RAN HFV in September 1968 as an air gunner attached to the 135th Helicopter Gunship Platoon, known colloquially as the Taipans. The gunships were well armed. Their usual weapons configuration consisted of 2 forward-firing miniguns, 2 7-shot rocket pods fixed beside the landing skids, and an M60 machine gun firing out of each side door. Assault helicopter companies generally flew in 3 types of missions: troop lift, combat assault, and general support. During the troop insertions, gunships generally left before the troop carriers and proceeded to the area of operations, where they joined the command and control aircraft and the flight commander. While the numbers varied from time to time, gunships usually operated in light fire teams of 2 aircraft with a third as backup. The 3 would rotate on and off the position so that in theory there are always at least 2 gunships present and available at all times, though in practice there was simply not enough aircraft available. The gunships would orbit the landing zone, ready to engage North Vietnamese positions when called in by either troops on the ground or the troop carriers as they arrived in waves. Troop extraction worked very much the same way but in reverse. When the landing zone was, quote, hot and the insertion or extraction point were opposed, combat assault involved close air support on the part of the gunships, which gave impressive firepower. In his role as a door gunner, Noel flew numerous missions providing suppression fire, troop lift helicopters, and also participated in frequent ground assaults on enemy positions and troop concentrations. This meant that by November 1968, Noel had already flown many missions as a door gunner. Not long after his arrival in country, Noel and the rest of the EMUs were based at Camp Martin Cox, otherwise known as Bearcat Base, 32 kilometers northeast of Saigon, which was regularly subjected to mortar attacks and perimeter raids. In January 1969, he was presented with the U.S. Air Medal with a V for Valor clasp by Lieutenant Colonel Wallace Baker, U.S. Army 222nd Combat Aviation Battalion. The citation read, quote, "By the direction of the President, the Air Medal is presented to LACM Noel E. Shipp, R. 59629, Royal Australian Navy, who distinguished himself by meritorious achievement while participating in sustained aerial flight in support of combat ground forces in the Republic of Vietnam. During the period of 12th September 1968 to 17 September 1968, he actively participated in more than 25 aerial missions over hostile territory in support of operations against communist aggression. During all these flights, he displayed the highest order of air discipline and acted in accordance with the best traditions of the service. By his determination to accomplish his mission, in spite of the hazards inherent with repeated aerial flights over hostile territory, and by his outstanding degree of professionalism and devotion to duty, He has brought credit upon himself, his organization, and the United States Army, unquote. It should be noted that this citation is the standard wording for all in the US Army who receive this award. On the 31st of May 1969, the aircraft of the 135th were extracting elements of the 7th Army of the Republic of Vietnam Infantry Division from a pickup zone in Dinh Thuong Province when it came under intense ground fire from an enemy armed with automatic weapons. Noel was not scheduled to fly that day, but had volunteered to take the place of another member of the unit. The duty officer's journal records the location is 16 kilometers west of Mai Tho, and at the time of the action was 0930 local. 3 aircraft were damaged and 1 pilot was injured, which necessitated his immediate medical evacuation. 2 gunships, one of which carried Noel as the door gunner, were then directed to the source of the ground fire and commenced attacking runs with rockets and machine guns. Noel's aircraft commander, US Army Captain Dennis Mike Phillips, was cleared to engage 2 of the enemy positions that he'd reported. It was observed by other air crews and troops on the ground that Noel was seen hanging half outside his aircraft, exposing himself to rocket backblast and intense enemy fire in order to bring more effective fire to bear on the target while also clearing blockages from the gunship's miniguns. American specialist Byron Bowden, the other door gunner, was also exposing himself to the intense fire while working his own M60. Not long into the attack, the helicopter was struck by ground fire and Captain Phillips was mortally wounded. The gunship rapidly lost altitude, preventing his co-pilot, fellow American warrant officer Stephen Martin, to regain control of the aircraft before it crashed and exploded into the terrain below. He would also be the only survivor as he crawled from the wreckage but died at Long Binh Hospital later that day. Even as the aircraft plummeted from the sky, Noel was seen firing on the enemy until the, quote, moment of impact, unquote. Noel and the other occupants of the helicopter were most likely killed on impact. Leading air crewman Noel Ervin Shipp would be 24 at the time of his death and be survived by his widow Gloria and 18-month-old son Darren. RAN HFV pilot and friend of Noel, Commander Max Speedy, DSC, reflected on the incident. Quote, Noel could not have known what was in store for him on that fateful day. He certainly would have had no thoughts of perishing in the crash that killed all 4 of the gunship's crew. He continued to fire as any hope to minimize injury to himself diminished, and he continued to fire to save those who'd been left in his crew. The actions of Noel and his crew probably saved hundreds of lives of soldiers on the ground at the time, unquote. This was mirrored by former Taipan crew chief Michael Gard, who stated in a 2011 inquiry that he, quote, could state unequivocally that the crew of Noel's aircraft knew what was about to happen moments prior to impact, unquote. Ground forces later returned to secure the area until the bodies were recovered and salvage operations completed. The wing lead gunship, commanded by Chief Warrant Officer Class 2 Robert Anders, US Army, attempted to provide fire support at the time of the crash, but there was little that could be done. After his body was recovered, it was repatriated back to Australia, where he was buried at French's Forest Cemetery in Sydney. Leading air crewman Noel Ervin Shipp is commemorated on Panel 4 of the Vietnam Roll of Honour at the Australian War Memorial. He is also commemorated on the East Rockingham Vietnam War Roll of Honour and the Fremantle Royal Australian Navy in Vietnam Memorial, both in Western Australia, the Grafton Clarence Valley Vietnam Veterans Memorial in New South Wales, the Calangur Vietnam Veterans Place in Queensland, the Point Peary Vietnam Veterans Honour Wall in South Australia, and the 135th AHC Memorial at the US Army Aviation Museum at Fort Rucker, Alabama. It should also be noted that Noel is also the 5th and final member of the Royal Australian Navy Helicopter Flight Vietnam to die on operational service in Vietnam, despite there being 2 additional rotations after Noel's death and a 5th being organised before the unit was eventually disbanded on the 8th of June 1971. In 2011, it was announced that Noel's actions on the 31st of May 1969 would be included in the inquiry into the unresolved recognition for past acts of naval and military gallantry and valour, known colloquially as the Valour Inquiry. The tribunal was convened following a question raised during a Senate Estimates Committee of the Australian Senate in 2010 asking why no member of the Royal Australian Navy had received the Victoria Cross. The tribunal would include 13 men, most of them were from the Navy, and I've already covered one of them in a previous episode, Captain Hector MacDonald Waller, and I'll be working through the remaining 11 in the new year. It was revealed during Noel's inquiry that he'd been recommended for the US Silver Star, the 3rd highest military award for gallantry in the United States system, and despite having received a written endorsement, the recommendation was downgraded to a Distinguished Flying Cross. However, once the recommendation was transferred to the Australian authorities, no award was issued, as during the Vietnam War, a quota system had been instituted, a practice that had existed in other countries from as far back as the First World War. In Vietnam, it was referred to as the operational scale of awards and was first raised in 1965. It had the intention of controlling the allocation of awards for gallant and distinguished service, including mention and dispatches. The scale laid down the maximum number of awards that could be granted in a given period and was based on the total number of personnel in theatre, and for airmen, the total number of combat hours flown. Even if he had been awarded the US award, it wouldn't have been until 1994 when the review of foreign awards even allowed the RAN personnel to wear them. The tribunal determined that even though Noel's actions on the 31st of May 1969 were definitely brave and gallant, according to testimonies put forward, it also wasn't something unique to him. Essentially, it was considered part of the job, so while Noel wasn't posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross or any other valorous award, as a result, the entire Royal Australian Navy Helicopter Flight Vietnam was awarded the Unit Citation for Gallantry by then Governor-General Sir Peter Cosgrove on the 18th of August 2018 after its own inquiry. Noel's actions, however, were not unrewarded, as on the 18th of September 2012, the then Chief of Navy, Vice Admiral Ray Griggs, announced that one of the Royal Australian Navy's 4 recruit divisions at HMAS Cerberus would be named Ship Division in his honour. While it would make a good bookend for the story, the listener who contacted me about their journey to Cerberus was not actually assigned to Ship Division. Now, it's usually at this time that I offer my thoughts on the episode, though the question here is, do I agree with the outcome of the Valor Inquiry? And to be honest, I do. While there is no disputing that his actions on the 31st of May 1969 were indeed brave and gallant, the fact that his officer, Specialist Bowden, and the rest of his crew all received the posthumous Distinguished Flying Crosses, singling out Noel for a Victoria Cross or equivalent award when the rest of his crew received a 4th tier medal wouldn't have been appropriate. But conversely, while the tribunal acknowledged that his medal recommendation for the DFC wasn't actioned, they made no suggestion to retroactively remedy this either. As the current system of awards in Australia does not have an Air Force equivalent medal like to a DFC, the only equivalent would be a Medal of Gallantry. While he never received a physical award for his actions, the men he saved on the ground were no doubt grateful for his service and sacrifice. And there you have it, that's the life, service, and legacy of leading aircraftsman Noel Ervin Shipp. And as this is the last episode of 2022, I wanted to thank you all so very much for your continued support through the second year of the podcast, and the stats that I've received reflect this. In total, you've all listened to the 9 hours of new content I put out this year and shared it amongst your friends and family. Which put I Was Only Doing My Job in the top 20% of all podcasts on Spotify. It's ranked 163rd in Australia and briefly ranked 160th in Ukraine. And those people from Ukraine who are listening, please get in contact with me. I want to make sure you guys are okay. On Apple Podcast, it's ranked 150th overall and 4th in Chartable's Best Military History Podcasts of 2022. I still have a hard time believing these numbers. I still think only a handful of people listen to this podcast, so thank you all again so much for having faith in this adventure and for your continued support. I would like to finally wish you all a safe and prosperous holiday season, and I hope to see you all again next year. As it is now currently Christmas Day, Merry Christmas to those who celebrate. For everyone else, I'll see you next year. Bye. Thanks for listening to the I Was Only Doing My Job podcast, a Doc Network production. This episode was written, produced, and audio engineered by me, Ross Manuel, with additional research done by Laurie Favell. I'd really appreciate it, and it would help out the show if you took some time to share this with a friend, or leave a review on Spotify, or Google Podcasts, or iTunes, or anywhere that you listen to podcasts, as it really helps other people find the show. If you want to know more about today's episode, with photos, show notes, and transcripts, head to www.thedocnetwork.net and follow the show on IWODMJ on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Don't worry, there's a link in the show notes. If you want to follow me for history-related hijinks and other nerdery, you can follow me on practically everything at Doc Winters. Once again, thanks for listening and catch you next time. Bye!